Old tins, forgotten puddings, and the meals your nan threw together without thinking. These are the working-class dishes Britain quietly left behind. 1. Bread and dripping. Bread and dripping was poverty food and a treat at the same time. That's the bit people forget. It wasn't just something eaten when things were bad. In a lot of working-class homes, it was the good bit, the part children hoped was left after Sunday dinner. The whole thing hinged on that enamel bowl or tin kept near the stove. After a joint of beef or pork came out of the oven, the fat and meat juices were poured in and left to set. As it cooled, a pale, solid layer formed on top, with a darker, jellied layer underneath that carried most of the flavour. During the week, slices of bread went straight into that fat, sometimes toasted first, sometimes not, then sprinkled with a bit of salt and maybe pepper if there was any spare. It also quietly marked out who had a roasting joint often enough to build up a decent layer. Families who only rarely afforded meat stretched the bowl for as long as possible, scraping thinner and thinner pieces across the bread. In some streets, children turned up at neighbours' doors with a plate and were given a scrape for their tea, no one making a fuss about it. The bowl usually sat there on the sideboard, streaked on the inside where the knife kept cutting into the same corner. 2. Bubble and squeak. So what actually went into proper bubble and squeak, beyond leftovers in a pan? At its simplest, it was two things: yesterday's potato and cabbage, fried together in fat until it held its shape. The name shows up in print by the late 1700s, but it settles in as a working-class regular through the 19th and early 20th centuries, especially in London and the industrial towns. A cook in a Bermondsey lodging house described boiling extra cabbage on a Sunday on purpose, just so there'd be enough to fry up on Monday morning. In a lot of households, that Monday pan was breakfast, dinner, and sometimes the evening meal as well. Here's where it doesn't quite match the cozy story. People talk about it as a waste-nothing dish, yet it relies on you having had a big enough roast to leave piles of veg behind. The same pan that held scraps in a back-to-back terrace kitchen was also turning up, dressed with a fried egg, on 1930s London cafe menus near railway stations. During the 1940s, Ministry of Food leaflets pushed versions bulked out with carrot or swede to cope with rationing, while older cooks quietly grumbled that without plenty of cabbage and a good crust from beef dripping, it wasn't really bubble and squeak at all. 3. Peas pudding. People tend to mix peas pudding up with mushy peas, or treat it like a kind of spread. In the older northeast sense, it's much more solid than that, a yellow mass that holds together so well you can slice it. Dried split peas were soaked, tied up in a cloth bag, then boiled for hours in the same pot as a bacon joint or ham hock, so the pea pulp picked up the pork fat and salt rather than needing extra seasoning later. Workhouse dietary tables from the 1830s list boiled peas 3 times a week, and Tyneside shipyard canteen menus from the 1920s show peas pudding alongside boiled ham at a price that undercut meat-heavy dishes. Once the bag came out of the pot, it was squeezed, mashed smooth with a bit of dripping or cooking liquor, and left in a bowl or basin to set into a firm dome. On the plate, it sat there as a pale yellow mound next to the meat, or was cut into thick wedges and pushed into a stotty. Whether that felt like a treat or just the cheapest way to fill up probably depended on the household. 4. Scouse, Liverpool stew. A dented metal ladle sinking into a huge pot of scouse in a dock canteen explains why the dish lasted. It was built for volume. Meat trimmed from tougher cuts, potatoes by the sack, onions and carrots if the kitchen budget stretched that week, all simmered together until everything broke down enough to serve with a single scoop. A canteen cook at the Liverpool docks described making it by the bucket, starting with whatever beef or mutton the butcher let go cheapest, then topping up with more water and vegetables as the midday rush emptied the pot. The exact right way to make scouse is surprisingly hard to pin down, and that's where it gets practical rather than romantic. Some older shipping company cookbooks lean towards more meat and pearl barley, closer to the Scandinavian and German sailor stews that likely gave Liverpool its version in the first place, while post-war charity kitchen recipes cut the meat right back and rely on potatoes and dripping for bulk and flavor. In between those two ends, you get the home versions. Families in terrace streets putting in leftover roast from Sunday, or stretching a single shin bone across a couple of nights by thickening the stew more and more. For boarding houses taking in sailors by the week, Scouse ticked every box. One pot, easy to reheat, and nobody could complain it wasn't authentic when every yard in the city was already doing it differently. Because it could be thinned out, enriched, or padded, depending on money and headcount, it slotted neatly into work canteens, mission halls, and boarding kitchens without much paperwork or planning, and that's how a dockside sailor's stew ended up as the defining dish of a whole city. 5. Lancashire hot pot. Potato slices laid in tight circles over a heavy brown dish sat ready on many Lancashire kitchen tables because hot pots slotted neatly around mill life and coal fires. The basic setup was simple enough that it could be scaled. Mutton neck or lamb scrag from the butcher's cheapest tray, onions, sometimes carrots, all buried under those potatoes so the meat braised slowly while the top browned. Cooperative bakehouse notices in northern towns offered space for families to leave their pots in the oven through the afternoon, which meant one firing of a big commercial range could cook dozens of meals while people were on shift. The exact makeup is messier once you start looking closely. Some 19th century household books from the region include oysters or kidney in hot pot, something that would have been out of reach for most mill hands, while interwar pamphlets aimed at thrifty housewives quietly drop the extras and lean harder on root vegetables and a spoon of dripping. Gas and electric cookers changed the timings again. Instead of walking a pot down to the baker's or the co-op, families could slide it in before an early shift and leave it on low, or start it at midday so it finished as the late turn clocked off. There are gaps the paperwork can't fill. Nobody was writing down every small decision in a back-to-back terrace kitchen, but the pattern is clear enough in bills, fuel adverts and cookery leaflets. Lancashire hot pot survived because it turned cheap cuts, shared heat and long working days into one organised oven-based routine. 6. Faggots and gravy. For a lot of working-class families, faggots and gravy were the big hot meal that still came from leftovers. Offal, stale bread and trimmings turned into something you'd actually look forward to. In butchers' shops across the Black Country and South Wales, trays of dense meatballs sat ready to be taken home, baked till firm and ladled over with dark onion gravy, so a couple of portions could be split between several plates with a heap of mash to fill the gaps. Kids were sent out holding an old enamel dish or pudding basin, handed over at the counter and brought back brimming, while parents quietly judged whether the butcher was using more liver this week or bulking it out with extra bread. In some streets, Friday or Saturday meant faggots from the chippy instead, sitting next to pies and sausages under steamy glass, ordered as faggots, chips and peas, and eaten in front of the telly rather than at a set table, which suited families coming off shifts at different times. Opinions formed early. Some swore by plenty of pepper and thick gravy, others complained about lumps or finding a stray bit of gristle, yet the dish kept turning up because it was one of the few ways to turn cheap offcuts into something that felt like a proper sit-down meal. By the mid-20th century, branded frozen versions in foil trays turned up in supermarkets and corner freezers, letting people who'd grown up with homemade batches keep eating them even as fewer households were willing to deal with raw hearts and liver in the sink. For a lot of people now, that box in the freezer aisle is the only reason the word faggots still means a plate of meatballs and gravy rather than disappearing completely. 7. Saveloy and peas. Why could you get saveloy and peas in some working-class chippies and never see it in others just a few streets away? The sausage itself is fairly standard. A highly seasoned, finely ground pork mix, dyed that blunt, almost cartoon red, originally linked to continental servalat-style sausages. Trade directories from the 1930s and 40s list specialist sausage makers in London, Tyneside, and the Midlands selling saveloys in bulk to fish shops, which suggests it spread through particular wholesalers rather than evenly across the country. In the northeast, the same wholesalers also pushed peas pudding made from dried yellow peas, sold in great tubs to be ladled into baps or onto plates, while in other areas, chip shops stuck to mushy peas made from marrow fats. So you end up with a dish that feels traditional everywhere it appears, even though its reach depended on which delivery lorry the owner signed up with. Hygiene inspection reports from the 1950s mention saveloys sitting in metal heaters on chip shop counters, kept hot in their own water, while trays of peas simmered separately nearby, which raises the odd detail that the pairing wasn't designed together at all. It's two cheap, holding, temperature-friendly items that happen to share the same cramped counter space. Owners liked saveloys because they arrived pre-cooked and uniform, far easier than making their own sausages. Peas or peas pudding, on the other hand, were usually made on site in big pans, soaking overnight in backroom kitchens where gas was already burning for chips. Some seaside kiosks pushed the combination as a filling, weatherproof snack, while city fish shops quietly dropped it when freezer space, frozen burgers and mass-produced pies started to crowd the menu. Yet in pockets of the northeast and parts of London, you can still find a row of red sausages steaming in a warmer with a battered ladle resting in a deep pot of peas beside them. 8. Toad in the hole. Some old guild regulations mention sausages being sold lightly seasoned, which seems minor, yet it shaped how toad in the hole behaved in the oven. The plainer the filling, the more the batter stood out, and early versions leaned heavily on that idea. The mix itself was simple: flour, eggs and liquid whisked until it loosened, then left alone long enough for the gluten to settle. The sausage went in first, that part hardly varied. Cooks browned them quickly so they wouldn't leak fat too late in the bake, because too much grease at the wrong moment flattened the rising edge. The batter was poured around them while the tin was already hot, and that shock of heat pushed the sides upward. Some households used beef dripping, others used whatever was left from the week, and the flavour shifted with whatever ended up in the pan. A few Victorian notes compare it loosely to Yorkshire pudding, though the method stayed more forgiving. It held its shape best when served straight from the tin, still puffed. 9. Corned beef hash. People tend to treat corned beef hash as a wartime joke dish, which is only half true. In one works canteen in Birmingham in 1952, a steward logged hash days twice a week on the rota. Tins of South American corned beef brought in by the case were diced into strict half-inch cubes so they wouldn't disappear completely once they hit the pan. Leftover boiled potatoes from the previous day were weighed, mixed through and stretched with onions and whatever fat the kitchen had cheapest that week. That canteen served several hundred workers on those days, yet the actual meat allocation per head sometimes dipped under 2 ounces. The name on the menu never changed: corned beef hash, even when the plate in front of you was mostly potato and browned edges. The same steward's notes show pay packets in that factory, barely clearing £6 to £7 a week before stoppages. The dish carried the word beef while delivering something much closer to a padded-out carb bomb that kept people on the line. How many of the people eating it knew exactly how thin that beef allowance really was? 10. Beef shin stew. Shin stew survived on canteen menus because it made the numbers work. Buyers ordered the cut by the box from wholesalers, paying less per pound than for brisket or chuck, but still able to advertise a proper beef meal on the board. The delivery came in as long, sinewy sections that kitchens broke down early in the morning, cubed and dropped into deep pans with stock, onions, and whatever root vegetables were cheapest on that week's delivery. Because shin needed hours of slow cooking before it turned tender, it suited places that already had big, steam-jacketed kettles running from breakfast onwards. Catering manuals from the 1950s and 60s quietly bundled it with so-called manufacturing cuts. The category meant for pies, pasties, and stews, where no one ever saw a neat slice. Once the stew was ladled out in the lunch rush, most customers only registered warmth, thickness, and the fact there was visible meat on the spoon. On internal costing sheets, shin often sat in the lowest priced meat bracket on the page. 11. Irish stew, British working class variant. Irish stew in British working class kitchens was usually more method than recipe. They used the cheapest fatty lamb they could get, often neck or scrag. Potatoes went in thick slices, not cubes. Onions were cut roughly. Those three went into an enamel pan in layers, starting and ending with potato, then covered with water, a stock cube, or leftovers from Sunday's gravy, and left on a low gas ring or the cooler part of a coal range for hours until the starch from the spuds and the collagen from the meat turned it into something heavier than soup. Carrots or swedes appeared when they were cheap. Pearl barley turned up in some regions as a way to bulk it further without adding extra meat, while many written recipes left it out entirely, even as people using them treated the grain as automatic. Whatever the variation, the one constant was the tight-packed stack of pale slices, hiding uneven chunks of meat underneath. 12. Liver and onions. Why did liver and onions end up as both treat tea and punishment on a plate? By the 1940s and 50s, it was pushed hard as the smart choice. Cheap protein, full of iron, easy to slice thin so a small piece of offal could be stretched across several plates without looking mean. Health campaigns praised liver as almost medicinal, yet most working-class households met it as whatever the local butcher had left, trimmed roughly, with visible tubes and ragged edges that made kids suspicious before it even hit the pan. Canteen cooks in factories and schools leaned on it because it behaved predictably in bulk. Dredge the slices in flour, fry fast, drop them into a tray, then bury everything under a shallow layer of gravy to stop it drying out under the hot lamp. When it went wrong, it went very wrong. Grey, tough, and with a bitter edge. Yet the same basic pieces, if cooked briefly and left pink in the center, stayed tender enough that people ordered it willingly in pubs and transport cafes. So the same cut that showed up as a resented midweek meal at home could reappear on a chalkboard special beside chips and peas, sliced neatly, onions fanned across the top, still spitting in the pan a minute before it reached the table. 13. Steak and kidney pudding. The kidney was never the bulk of the pudding, yet it controlled how the whole thing was made. A works canteen supervisor in Derby in the late 1960s described their standard tray: diced beef by the bucket, a much smaller tub of ox kidney, and sacks of sweet mix turned into a heavy dough that could be dropped over enamel basins and crimped fast before steaming. The ratio stayed roughly 4 parts steak to 1 part kidney, because any less and the catering supplier wouldn't class it as steak and kidney on the invoice, which meant a different price band and a different code on the weekly order sheet. The actual diners mostly wanted the gravy and the soft crust. Many pushed the darker pieces to the side of the plate. Still, the kitchen had to cut the kidney carefully into neat cubes so it cooked at the same pace as the beef, and someone was always tasked with trimming out the tougher white core that nobody wanted to see. If most people were paying for the name and the crust, who were the kidneys really there for? 14. Bedfordshire clanger. A Bedfordshire clanger was often stamped with a little ridge running along the top. 19th century village cookbooks from the county describe it as a long, thick, sweet pastry, crimped shut along the sides so it could be carried in a pocket or a bag without leaking. Inside, the dinner end held things like bacon, cold roast meat, or leftover potato, cut small enough that it heated evenly when the whole roll was steamed or boiled. The pudding end was usually jam or stewed fruit. Some Women's Institute booklets from the 1930s list specific combinations: beef and onion at one side, then apple or plum at the other, with a short strip of plain dough between to stop the fillings bleeding together. The dough itself did most of the practical work. Heavy with suet, it stayed firm when packed into a tin, and it didn't crumble when sliced in half on a workbench or beside a field gate. Later bakery versions dropped the sweet end altogether, but kept the same solid tube shape. 15. Welsh caul. Most people treat Welsh caul as a recipe, a list of ingredients, a time in the oven, a picture on a page. In the households that leaned on it, it behaved more like a piece of equipment than a dish, with a pot started first thing in the morning, stock and tougher cuts going in early, then different people arriving through the day and dipping into the same slowly thickening mixture whenever work or weather finally let them through the door. Children came in from school and took mostly liquid with a bit of vegetable. Older relatives sat longer, fishing out soft pieces from the bottom. In a lot of homes, the person bringing in the wages was quietly given first refusal on the larger bits of meat, which meant the same pot could feel generous to one person and a bit stripped to another, even though nobody had technically cooked a second meal. Over a week, that routine shaped how people planned everything else around food. Leftover lamb from Sunday would be cut small and disappear into Monday's base. A neighbor's spare leeks or swedes might go in midweek. By Friday, the whole thing was closer to a vegetable broth, and the pattern reset when the next joint or batch of bones turned up. As gas and then electric cookers took over from open fires, that constant simmer became less common, and in a lot of households, call shifted from being the thing that was always there to something made on purpose for a particular evening or for St. David's Day. 16. Panacalty, Northeast Bake. Panacalty was meant to be the cheap, hot answer in the Northeast. It turns up under half a dozen spellings on 20th century menus around Sunderland and South Shields, usually defined as layers of sliced potato, onion and meat pieces, baked low in a tin until the top stiffened and the bottom caught the fat and juices into a kind of gravy. A canteen manager at a wareside yard in the late 1940s described ordering off-cut mix by the stone from a local butcher for this dish, yet the same yard's payday treat version switched to tinned corned beef from South America, which had to be shipped in by the crate, hauled through the docks, and cost more per portion than the leftovers it supposedly replaced. The name itself looks thrifty and rough, but most of the classic descriptions assume you already had yesterday's joint, or at least a pan of bacon scraps, which quietly cuts out the households that never saw a Sunday roast in the first place. So in practice, the people eating the most panacalty were often the ones a step up from the very bottom rather than the absolute poorest. In the 1930s, cooperative stores in Durham and Jarrow ran offers on panacalty potatoes by the stone, and yet the dish is still remembered as a way to stretch ingredients, even though those sacks were being bought specifically to go straight into the oven rather than to use anything up. Some pit villages talked about it as a Monday meal tied to washing day, when nobody had time to fuss over the stove, but others served it on Friday evenings after overtime, which meant turning the oven on again for hours, just as everyone was counting shillings before rent, fuel, and club payments. Recipes from the 1950s add carrot, suet crusts, or even a splash of brown sauce, while others in the same street stick stubbornly to potato, onion, and meat, and the only constant between them is that you needed enough fuel to keep the heat going long enough for the layers to soften all the way through. 17. Kedgeree, working class post-war version, bake. A lot of post-war kedgeree in Britain never saw smoked haddock at all. In council school kitchens and factory canteens, the word on the weekly menu stayed the same, but the tray that reached the tables was often rice-stained yellow with cheap curry powder, bulked out with peas and dotted with whatever scraps of white fish happened to be available that week. A Ministry of Food canteen leaflet from the early 1950s even gave a version using frozen blocks of fish offcuts, stirred through boiled rice and powdered egg, then baked until it's set into a sliceable slab. That's how you end up with a dish still called kedgeree that, for a lot of working-class diners, barely matched the hotel breakfast version they might have seen in glossy adverts. The clearest glimpse comes from one shipyard canteen rota on the Tyne, where kedgeree appears every other Thursday in the early 1960s as a main course priced lower than the meat pies but higher than plain stew, suggesting the kitchen was treating it as a way to stretch a controlled amount of fish across a big workforce. Former kitchen hands from similar yards described tipping catering-sized tins of fish into enormous pans of rice, then folding in reconstituted egg and a spoon or two of curry powder from government-supplied tins, while others remember days when the fish ran short and the staff served the rice mix anyway because men were already queued at the counter. Some post-war cookery books aimed at housewives on a budget insist kedgeree should always include smoked fish and neatly quartered eggs, yet school menus and canteen plans from the same period are vague, listing only fish and rice, curried, or kedgeree without detail, which leaves a gap between the official image of the dish and what ended up on ordinary plates. That gap matters here because it turns kedgeree from a borrowed Anglo-Indian breakfast into a flexible label that kitchens could slap on whatever rice and fish combination met their cost and supply limits that week. By the time frozen convenience blocks and boil-in-the-bag portions arrived in the late 1960s, a lot of people whose only experience of kedgeree came from those canteens remembered it not as a luxurious, gently smoked breakfast, but as a dense square of yellow rice cut with a metal spatula and flopped onto a plate with a single pale strip of fish lying across the top. 18. Sardines on toast, ration-era staple. By the late war years, sardines on toast had settled into place as a normal, almost unremarkable meal. It was quick, cheap, and used things people actually had. Ministry of Food leaflets pushed tinned fish as a good standby, showing plates where the sardines were either laid in neat rows or mashed to stretch over more bread, which says a lot about how closely people watched every slice. The tins themselves varied, some in tomato sauce, some in oil, with the brand often deciding whether they were eaten straight from the can or disguised under brown sauce or a scrape of mustard. The toast did most of the work. Bread might be part wholemeal, thin cut from a national loaf, sometimes slightly stale because nothing was thrown away. Once crisped, it became a base strong enough to hold soft fish without falling apart. Mass observation surveys mention people having it as a late meal after shifts, especially where canteens were bare or closed, and it shows up in wartime cookery pamphlets as both supper and breakfast, depending on what else was available. What's harder to pin down is how many kept that habit once fresh food came back and the tins were no longer the only easy choice. 19. Cheese and potato pie. How do you feed a whole dining hall on almost no meat and very little cheese? Cheese and potato pie solved that on a tray. School kitchens and factory canteens could boil sacks of potatoes, mash them with a small weighed-out block of rationed cheese, bulk it with onion or leek, then spread it into huge enamel tins and bake until the top firmed up. Prep could be staggered through the morning by a handful of staff, using steam ovens that were already running for puddings. The same basic mix worked in any size dish, so local authorities could write one recipe and roll it out across dozens of schools without changing equipment or retraining cooks. It was filling, it reheated without falling apart, and leftovers could be turned into fried cakes the next day. Councils kept it on rotation even when rationing eased because it was cheap, predictable, and slotted neatly into bulk purchasing contracts for potatoes and cheese long after more glamorous dishes were dropped from the order sheets. 20. Bread pudding, boiled or baked. In wartime bread pudding, most of the sweetness came from scraps of dried fruit. That small shift meant kitchens could save precious sugar coupons for drinks and jam. One canteen cook later described tipping heel ends of loaves into a tin bath, soaking them with watered-down milk, then squeezing the lot by hand before mixing in whatever raisins, peel, or margarine allowance she'd been given that week. The same base could be tied in cloth and boiled in a copper or pressed into trays and baked, so kitchens didn't have to change the order sheets or equipment when fuel, staff, or oven space suddenly changed. Children queued for the baked version and dragged their feet when the steamed one appeared, yet the boiled cloth puddings kept turning up on menus because they used less fat and were easier to portion neatly. It sat in a strange space between treat waste management system and calorie delivery. When rationing eased, the boiled version faded from mass catering, while the baked tray version carried on in school kitchens and charity cookbooks for years. 21. Jam roly-poly. On some canteen menus, jam roly-poly was written down as sweat roll, sweet. The name sounded plain, but it usually meant a thick spiral of dough with a sharp line of jam through the middle. In Ministry of Food leaflets from the early 1940s, it sat in the same category as sponge and syrup puddings, flagged as a way to push calories after a thin main course. One wartime factory canteen schedule from Lancashire sets out jam roly-poly twice a week, using a basic sweat paste rolled with 1 ounce of plum or mixed fruit jam per portion, then wrapped in cloth and boiled, or laid in long tins and baked when oven space allowed, and deliveries of sweat or margarine actually turned up on time. The same sheet specifies serving it with watered evaporated milk instead of full custard, which kept the dairy allocation low but still made it feel like a proper pudding to workers coming off a 10-hour shift. By the late 1950s, Education Committee recipes had swapped most of the sweat for baking fat, shifted almost entirely to tray-baked versions, and kept it on school menus under the shorter name jam roll, printed in block capitals next to custard on the weekly sheet. 22. Semolina pudding. Semolina pudding was supposed to be foolproof. In bulk kitchens, it started with a fixed ratio, measured scoops of fine semolina into a set volume of milk or diluted milk, brought up to heat in wide pans where any lapse in stirring welded the grains straight onto the base. Official recipes promised smooth results after a set number of minutes at a simmer, yet surviving instructions can't agree on whether sugar went in early with the dry ingredients or late at the end, and that difference alone could decide whether it thickened properly or clumped into rubbery lumps. Some kitchens baked it after the hob stage, spreading the mixture into shallow tins so a firmer layer formed on top while the center stayed soft, while others stopped at the pan and served it straight, which saved fuel but left it more prone to setting into a solid block once it cooled on the counter. There are school dinner versions that insist on a spoon of jam or syrup in the middle of each portion, and others that leave it plain, just a pale rectangle marked with the lines from the serving spoon. 23. Stovies, English and Scottish variants. Most people talk about stovies like it's one fixed Scottish dish, and that's already wrong. In 1940s and 50s Glasgow newspaper recipes, stovies usually start with sliced leftover roast, potatoes and onions, cooked low in beef dripping until the meat breaks into shreds, salt, pepper, maybe a splash of stock, and it stays on the hob until everything collapses into one heap. Some versions insist it must never go near the oven because that would turn it into a bake instead of a stovetop stew. Across the border in Northumberland and County Durham, Women's Institute leaflets and co-op pamphlets from the same decades show stovies built from tinned corned beef, margarine and potatoes, sometimes with carrots, sometimes with nothing besides onion and a stock cube. One 1960s electric cooker booklet uses the word for a layered dish baked in a casserole, covered with a lid and forgotten for an hour, even though older cooks linked the name to stove and slow stewing on top of the range rather than inside it, which leaves a gap between the name people repeat and the methods they quietly changed. So when someone says they grew up on proper stovies, which of these dishes do they mean? 24. Rabbit pie. By the late 1950s, rabbit pie was already slipping from being a normal weekday meal to something people described as what we used to have. On the plate, it looked ordinary enough. A shallow enamel dish, a pale pastry lid, gravy seeping through in dark patches where the bone ends pressed against the crust. The filling underneath was rarely neat. Rabbit was jointed roughly, pieces still on the bone, mixed with sliced potato, a few scraps of onion, and thickened with flour shaken in an old jar. Households treated it as a way to stretch one animal across several mouths, which makes the timing odd because during rationing rabbits weren't rationed at all, and countryside stories talk about them as a nuisance that still needed trapping even when meat coupons were tight, yet the dish starts vanishing just when the animals were finally being culled on a huge scale. By the early 1970s, most pie adverts in supermarket brochures showed chicken or beef instead. 25. Pilchard curry, Cornish tin miners adaptation. Pilchard curry was never standard Indian restaurant fare. It was a Cornish solution to a mining problem. One cook in a Redruth lodging house described men coming off the late shift in the 1930s, handing over a dented tin of pilchards in tomato sauce and expecting it turned into curry before they'd finished washing. She tipped the contents into a blackened pan, added sliced onion, leftover boiled potato, a spoon of generic curry powder from the grocer, and stretched it with tea or water so it would cover more bread. The curry powder itself had probably crossed half the empire in sacks before it hit that counter, yet the meal it produced stayed rooted under Cornish soil, eaten with thick crusts instead of rice, balanced on miners' knees beside their boots. On some pay nights, she said, the same pan was used twice, Once for the men coming up and once for the men going down, the pilchard tins stacked empty by the back step.